Thank you so much for joining us. Before we begin, I'd like to thank the friends of the library who make these programs possible. I'd also like to thank our friends at Barrett Bookstore who have Dennis's book on the shelf. I hope you can see this even with the reflection. And another lovely coffee table book called Frederick Law Olmsted, Designing the American Landscape, which I don't have a copy of because it's out, but it's really beautiful. So think of those when you're thinking of little Easter presents this weekend. Also, type your questions into the Q&A box and we'll answer them at the end. All right, let me tell you a little bit about Dennis. Dennis Drabelle is a writer and former attorney. During the 1970s, he was an attorney advisor at the United States Department of Interior and counsel to the Assistant Secretary of the Interior for Fish and Wildlife and Parks. Drabelle was a contributing editor to the Washington Post book world for more than 30 years. His books include Mile High Fever and The Great American Railroad War. His articles on the environment and national parks have appeared in Outside Magazine, Smithsonian, Sierra, Wilderness, Backpacker, and many others. Along with Dennis this evening, we have Jonathan Olmsted. Jonathan Olmsted was born in Boston in 1942, attended Phillips Exeter Academy, graduated from Stanford University, and for the last 45 years has lived in Darien, Connecticut with his wife, Janet. He was a banker in New York, London, San Francisco. Then he was the president of Cameron Communications, a small presentation consulting firm, for 30 years before retiring. Frederick Law Olmsted and Jonathan Olmsted were both descended from James Olmsted, who came to America from England in 1632 and was one of the founders of Hartford, Connecticut in 1636, where Frederick Law Olmsted was born in 1822. This is his 200th anniversary. So I will let the gentleman speak and we'll get some questions going. And let's see, Dennis, why don't you give us a little oversight and a little intro to your book, and we can go from there.
Yes. Well, the book is an attempt to explain where the idea for national parks came from and how it evolved. I think we think of national parks because they're all over the world as something that's been with us for a long, long time. But really, until the middle of the 19th century, there was just no such thing. And so that was what the book is about. And I'll answer the question with that level and let you go ahead.
All righty. Well, when we look at the cover of the book, it has Yosemite on it. Do you want to speak a little bit about that? Maybe you have a cover that doesn't shine.
Yeah, I don't know if mine's any better, but it has. So the title is The Power of Scenery. The subtitle is Frederick Law Olmsted and the Origin of National Parks. And here we have a picture of Yosemite Falls, but we all know that the first national park was Yellowstone, whose 150th anniversary we celebrated on March 1st of this year. So am I guilty of what we might call false coverage? Well, I would say no, because the book developed in a kind of a strange way. When I first wrote it, I had Yellowstone kind of foremost in mind. And I thought the hero of the book was going to be Ferdinand Hayden, who was a great geologist. He led surveys to the Western United States summer after summer during the 1870s and 80s. And he did one in 1871 to Yellowstone, which became the sort of stepping stone to make Yellowstone a national park. Every fall, he would come back to Washington and write a report about what he had seen. He was operating under authority of Congress. These were official surveys. And so Hayden would write a report, the government printing office would print it, and they would go like hotcakes. They were free to the public, first come, first served. And the reason for that is that people were so desperate for information about the West. And so Yellowstone was the survey for 1871. Yellowstone became a national park in 1872. Hayden was a great lobbyist on the Hill to get that to happen. So I thought he would be the hero. But the more I did research, the more I realized that Frederick Law Olmsted was just a pervasive influence in several different ways. So I changed the focus to some extent. And there's certainly a lot about Hayden in the book still, but Olmsted became my sort of man of action for this book.
Very well done. Would you both like to talk a little bit about the perception of the US in the early 1800s from the eyes of a European? Would Jonathan like to start?
No, I mean, that was good in the book. They all came over and said we didn't have any culture, any art, any music, and so I think that what we had to offer was landscape. I mean, natural landscapes.
Yeah, we had to find a way to sort of compete with the great cathedrals and castles and other works of art in Europe. And so almost accidentally, and a lot of this had to do with our painters who would be painting the scenery that was shown both in the States and in Europe, and showing how magnificent our scenery was. So sooner or later, that became something we could put up against all the culture of Europe as something we could contribute and point to with pride.
Yeah.
Also, along those lines, let's talk about Niagara Falls and what it was back in the 1800s and what it became and what it symbolized.
Well, you know, Frederick Law Olmsted went to Niagara Falls as a boy and was a little bit surprised, I think, at the carnival-like atmosphere there. And then he went back in 1868 or 9, I forget which of the two, but he was on assignment to start thinking about planning the city of Buffalo. And of course, Niagara Falls is about 20 miles away. And he was appalled. It had gotten even worse than he was there. There were something like 200 or 300 landowners on either side of the river, the Niagara River, and they had bought their little holdings along the river and set up their own commercial businesses to lure tourists to their overlooks for money, of course, their boats that plied the river, their restaurants, their gift shops. And the tourists were just kind of beleaguered. You would get there and you'd find their touts grabbing you almost by the elbow and trying to steer you to their place. And the worst example was there was one outfit that had a nice overlook and they said it's free. And you would go into through their turnstile into a little sort of a holding room, and they'd say, but you've got to wear a slicker because otherwise you're going to get drenched. And here's what we want for the slicker, $5, which was a lot of money in those days. And if the people wouldn't pay up, they would just hold them prisoner in this room. Well, that was the worst example, but there are a lot of other examples. It was really a bad place. And
the other thing because of the falls and the generation of power, there were milling companies and industrial plants there besides all the amusements you were talking about. And those things blocked the views and probably spewed smoke, I don't know. But New York State had to do something, and it was a conservation movement that got action, at least to take some of that down and create a space that the public could enjoy. Some paths, some greenery, some trees.
And Frederick Law Olmsted was really the prime mover. When he was there in 1869, he made a vow that he would do his best to change this around. It took about 15 or 20 years, but he was really responsible. And in Niagara, it's really interesting throughout the history of the park idea, the national park idea. Niagara was constantly cited as the counterexample of what not to do with a great, stupendous natural resource. Don't let it be bought up by private interests who want to just do nothing but exploit it and charge people money to see it.
And that happened, I mean, there was a desire by developers around Yellowstone and around Yosemite to be able to get in there and build things that weren't appropriate. And I think Frederick Law Olmsted said, you know, you can build roads in and you could build maybe a lodging, but it should be in the taste or natural. to the environment, and you shouldn't put in golf courses or ski runs or things that don't belong.
Yeah, his big thing was he was very much a small D Democrat, and he wanted ordinary people to be able to see and enjoy these wonderful places, not just rich people. Yosemite, when Olmsted got to it, I think it was in 1864 when he first saw it, was very difficult to get to. You had to be rich to get there. You almost had to mount an expedition to get there. The terrain was so difficult and the access was so terrible. So he wrote a wonderful report about it. Maybe we'll come back to that in a little while. But in that report, all he wanted to do was put in access roads and maybe a few cabins for people to stay overnight. But he didn't want to develop it much more than that.
Yeah.
Now that
when you say you'll come back to it, it's that was the one surprise to me in the book, that he had offered ideas on preservation in perpetuity and don't change anything, and his fellow commissioners bushwhacked him in a way. I mean, they took away parts of it, at least, and because I think they wanted to develop.
Well, let me tell that story, Kathleen, if that's okay with you.
Sure, sure.
So it's true that there was no direct influence of Frederick Law Olmsted on the creation of Yosemite, but Congress, in creating, they carved out of the federal estate Yosemite Valley and a nearby grove of sequoia trees, gave them to the state of California on condition that it be managed as a wilderness park. But nobody knew what that was. This was a first. It was the precursor, of course, to Yellowstone, but nobody knew that at the time. So Congress decided to tell the governor of the state in the law that he should appoint 8 commissioners to advise him on how to run this park. And Olmsted, being the workaholic that he was all of his life, he just, worked. He sat down and wrote a 7,000-word report. After being named to this commission, of course, I forgot that step, but here you had in the middle of California, the designer of Central Park. Who better to put on this commission to advise about this park than Frederick Law Olmsted? So he took the assignment so seriously that he wrote this report. It went to the governor, but a rather narrow-minded man named Josiah Whitney, who was the head of the California Geological Survey, and after whom Mount Whitney, the tallest peak in the lower 48 states, was named, noticed that in Olmsted's report, he called for $37,000 to be appropriated and spent on the access roads and the cabins and the other small improvements that he recommended. And Whitney said, oh, no, that's going to come out of my budget. I can't have that happen. So he convinced the governor to suppress the report, and the governor did. But some reporters who were there and who knew about the report wrote about it in their dispatches, and it lived on in various ways and influenced the Yosemite Park and other parks as well.
Interesting. Jonathan, would you talk a little bit about his role in Central Park and how he started and the competition that awarded him the opportunity to redesign Central Park or design Central Park?
Sure. I mean, the first thing he did was he had been in publishing, and he knew a lot of people in New York, and he put his name in to be superintendent of this land that the state had set aside in Manhattan to be a park. Not to design it, but just to supervise the preparation for a park. So he had a lot of people, I don't know, thousands of workers there moving land around and trying to move wetlands and everything. But Calvert Vaux had worked for this guy named Downing, who was a renowned landscaper. And everybody thinks that, it might have been Downing and Vaux that had designed the park. But Downing was killed in an accident in the Hudson River. And Vaux asked Olmsted, because he knew about there was going to be a competition for the design. to collaborate with him on the design, because he didn't have Downing anymore, and he knew Olmsted knew every inch of the property from having worked with the laborers who were preparing it. So they set about designing a plan, and Vaux would do anything that involved a bridge or a tunnel or any structures in the park. And Olmsted probably did the greens and the trees and the bushes and everything, the roadways and paths. But so they collaborated, and there were 32 entries submitted, and they picked Olmsted and Vaux, and they called that plan
the Greensward Plan.
Greensward Plan, yeah. And there were always struggles. There's people wanted to do something different. They wanted a big grand entrance, or like the Arc de Triomphe or something, but they stuck to their guns, and they got the south end opened in 1858. And that was such a hit that, the word spread. Other cities wanted a park. And then it took 15 years to complete the park to the north during the Civil War. I mean, they just kept working on it. So he was in the right place at the right time. And having done all this traveling and walking, he knew what he liked and he knew what he wanted. And he based a lot of it on that Birkenhead Park in Liverpool that he'd visited. One of the few that was open to everybody in the public, whereas everything else in England was private. So he wanted to do something similar. And you'll see that Central Park has a lot of curved paths and curved roads and very, no straight lines. And it's very much like Birkenhead Park. So that's how he got involved. And they had to keep fighting for the budget, because they always were going over the budget, and they had to fight developers and the politics, but they succeeded. And
I would just add,
extraordinary that it was his first project. He'd never done a landscape before that.
Right. I would just add that there's a great commonality between Central Park and the Yosemite report, because in both cases, Olmsted was trying to give to ordinary people kind of an oasis, a wonderful outdoors, site that in England and in Europe, those kinds of things were really just the private preserves of the wealthy or the noble or even kings and queens. So in Central Park, the idea was that rich New Yorkers could go away to the White Mountains or the Adirondacks to have relief from the heat and the oppression of the city during the summer, but ordinary people could not. And that's what Central Park was designed to do. Well, similarly in California, in his report, Olmsted wants to make sure that Yosemite does not become a private playground for the rich, that it becomes accessible to all people. So that small d Democrat just lives on in both projects, coast to coast.
And it's always great if your first project is a big success, because that puts you on the map.
Yes.
He never had a problem after that getting work, because
that's right.
Cities like the US and the US Capitol,
right,
Chicago World's Fair, schools and colleges and private estates, he was busy till he died.
Talk a little bit about the Buffalo Park system, because I'm not sure many people are familiar with that.
Well, when he came back from the Mariposa, where he had discovered Yosemite, somebody asked him to develop a park system for Buffalo, which was connecting 6 parks, existing parks, with 7 parkways and 8 circles. And the parkways had a middle strip, a meridian. They were like Paris boulevards. And he said it was like extending park fingers into the city. People could walk and drive around the circles. And the largest park in Buffalo was Delaware Park. But that's when he was so close to Niagara Falls that he could look at what had happened to Niagara Falls and just be aware of what the conservation effort needed to be there. But Buffalo, then he said, well, you said it to Dennis, that he said Buffalo was the best planned city in the country. Of course, he planned it. So he was patting himself on the back, but that's what other cities, Boston ended up doing the Emerald Necklace, and Chicago did parks, and San Francisco, they all wanted what Buffalo had. And in those days, Buffalo was a major city. I mean, it did go downhill for a while. I think it's coming back.
Right.
This is working backwards a little bit, but in the beginning of your book, you talk about the word sublime. Would you elaborate on what that actually meant in that time?
Yes, it's interesting because it's an example of how people have to be taught to look correctly. For centuries, people thought mountains were ugly and scary and really kind of horrifying. And of course, they sort of got in the way of travel too, so I suppose they were also nuisances. But mountains really did not have a very good reputation among Europeans, especially. Well, Edmund Burke, the Irish philosopher, wrote a book on the sublime. And his real contribution, I think, was, and he talked about how the feeling of sublimity is when you see something that just sort of takes you out of yourself. It's so magnificent or ennobling, but it also can work with something that's really scary, not too scary. If it absolutely horrifies you, maybe you're just not even going to look at it. But if it kind of gives you that kind of a little queasy thrill that maybe looking over the edge of a high mountain can do, or coming close to a raging waterfall or river, that's a form of the sublime. And that form of the sublime really applied well to a lot of the scenery in the United States. So it gave us a kind of a concept to use in praising that kind of landscape and wanting to save it.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about the influence of art on the formation of the national parks and which figures were the most important.
Oh gosh, there were a lot, but I guess to depart from Olmsted just for a minute, maybe the two most influential were the people who went along with Ferdinand Hayden to Yellowstone in 1871, the painter Thomas Moran and the photographer William Henry Jackson. Jackson took wonderful photographs of the geysers and the sort of paint pots and those formations that are all over Yellowstone. Thomas Moran painted a magnificent painting of Yellowstone Canyon, which is in the one of the Smithsonian museums in Washington. To this day, it sort of takes up a whole staircase overview. It's just a magnificent picture. And he also made a lot of watercolors. So those paintings and those photographs were taken up with Hayden, by Hayden, to Capitol Hill to try to persuade members of Congress. You've got an incredible phenomenon here. You've got to save it.
Let's see, what else?
Well, Yosemite was promoted a bit with Bierce and the photographers and the painters.
Right, the photographer Carlton Watkins, especially there.
I loved, this sort of takes us back a little bit, but I loved your chapter about you can have the Arno. Here we were trying to promote our natural scenery, and the Italians loved Arno, and you have Mark Twain said the Florentines call the Arno a river. It's 4 feet deep. They even helped the delusion by building bridges over it. He said, are they too good to wade?
Yes, this was the period when the United States, when Americans were starting to really push back against the snooty Europeans who kept telling them, that they didn't really have anything worth looking at or going to. And Mark Twain was, of course, being very satirical, and I think very effectively, in calling the fabled Arno not much more than a little creek.
Yeah. It seems like each chapter has a theme, because you have The theme about the sublime, which is the land of the free and the home of the brave. The counterexample, which was Niagara Falls. Henry David Thoreau, and the wilderness is the preservation of the world. You keep bringing in quotes from great writers and thinkers, and every chapter has a great quote. Or Henry, what is it? To Colin Bryant, he talked about a superb diamond set in lead.
Oh, that's Niagara Falls. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I was an English major, so I probably drew on a lot of that. And my specialty was American literature, so I think I was able to draw on some of that, but I'm glad it works for you.
Yeah, I loved it.
Thank you.
Last week, Jonathan mentioned how many careers Frederick Law Olmsted had served him well. And let's talk a little bit about what he did during the Civil War.
Yes. So he was a great Unionist. He really firmly believed in saving the Union and wanted to do something about it. And I think that by 1861 or 2, he really was a bit burned out at Central Park also. So he looked around and he got a job as being CEO, although I think it wasn't quite that kind of a title back then, but of the United States Sanitary Commission, which was a precursor to the Red Cross, made up mostly of volunteers. Most of them were women, by the way, and he was the director of it. And he did a terrific job of setting it up. It really started just about the time of the war. And their job was to provide to the boys in blue things that maybe the official government wouldn't give them necessarily, or that the ossified medical bureau of the Army was not very efficient at providing. So it could be everything from bandages and surgical implements to books and brandy, whatever was needed to help the Union soldiers, have a better life, and especially if they were wounded. There's one little story I told in the book. After the Battle of Gettysburg, there was something like, I don't know, 600 or 700 men in blue who had lost a limb or otherwise were crippled, and the Army Bureau was just not getting the crutches to them fast enough. But the Sanitary Commission stepped in and sped 1,200 crutches to them from Washington almost overnight to Gettysburg. That's the kind of performance they could put in.
Well, he was an organizer, and that's when he was superintendent of Central Park. Before the design, it was organizing movement of soil and rock and water. And so that job was organizing. And he got these ships and turned them into hospitals. So they were hospital ships, and they needed, a place to take the wounded Union soldiers, just the Union soldiers. But
right,
it was the precursor to the American Red Cross. And that only lasted, not even for the whole war, but a good part of it. He got it going, and it probably continued.
Let's stop and think for a minute. Here's a man who both has this incredible artistic gift and the sensitivity to nature, and he also has, I think, a totally unrelated talent for running projects, for organizing bureaucracies. It's just a remarkable set of skills that Olmsted had. I'm just always in wonder when I think about that.
From the Civil War position, he went out west to the silver mine. Is that correct?
It was
gold mine.
Gold mine.
Yeah.
It was the Mariposa estate, and on the estate was a gold mine, which was traded on the New York Stock Exchange, but it didn't produce enough gold, and I think there was some shenanigans in Wall Street. Anyway, he did take he brought his family out to the mining town, and that's when they took trips into the Sierras, and that's when they kind of went camping, and they found Yosemite, and that was very fortunate.
It certainly was.
And that the Mariposa Grove was also part of that time of discovery.
Yes.
Well, no, they're two different Mariposas. Mariposa, is a Spanish word for butterfly. It's a beautiful word. Mariposa, it has a nice ring to it. There are a lot of places in California that are named Mariposa. So the Mariposa Grove was the grove of sequoia trees that Congress added to Yosemite Valley in 1864 when they made the park and gave the park to the state. The Mariposa estate was about, I don't know how many miles away. I would say at least 50 miles away, maybe more. It was in the Sierra Nevada foothills. So they're two different things.
Well, but it's also interesting. It was President Abraham Lincoln who signed the act and asked the state to run it. And then the state had commissioners. And I think Frederick Law Olmsted was the lead commissioner, and he wrote that report, but it didn't get in everybody's hands.
Right.
I especially enjoyed that story where you talk about some people taking the trees down for an amusement in Europe. Would you tell people about that?
Well, it's a little complicated, but I'll try to do my best. So Senator John Conness, who was a California first-term senator, in fact, that was his only term, was approached by somebody who suggested making Yosemite into a park. And so he took the lead in doing this. This is in 1864. And so we're in the middle of the Civil War. How are you going to draw attention in the Senate and the House to something that's so novel? Giving land to a state to do nothing but make it into a park, not to make it into productive land by farming it or mining it or something like that. So it's this novel idea. So Conness hit upon this. He thought he remembered that a sequoia tree had been chopped down, cut into sections, sent to Europe for the London Crystal Palace Exposition of 1851. And the Brits all scoffed at it and said, that can't be real. There can't be any such trees. The Yanks are just pulling our legs. So that's why, and that's why Conness emphasized the grove of sequoias on the floor of the Senate rather than Yosemite Valley. He hardly said anything about Yosemite Valley because he wanted to use the ridicule of the Brits to kind of get everybody's patriotic backup. So they would, show the world that we actually do have these wonderful trees and, by the way, also Yosemite Valley. Well, the fact of the matter is he had the story completely wrong. He remembered it absolutely wrong. There was another Crystal Palace done by that sort of mountebank, P.T. Barnum. He built a Crystal Palace imitation in New York, and another tree was cut down a few years later, I think in the mid 1850s, and the sections were sent to New York. And that was where the scoffing came. The New Yorkers said, come on, we don't believe that came from California. We don't believe that's natural. So Conness got the story just totally twisted up. But no one cares, of course, because the result was we got the park.
And tell people about the fact that it was not a national park, it was a state park.
Right. So Congress carved this property, the two properties, the Mariposa Grove and Yosemite Valley, out of the public lands, gave it to California on condition that they make a wilderness park out of it. And because nobody knew what to do with that, they advised the governor to appoint commissioners, one of whom became Olmsted.
Let's see.
And it was the first time that public land had been set aside by the federal government to be a park. Now, it was a state park, not a national park. And what Dennis said earlier is that the only reason Yellowstone was not a state park is that it wasn't in a state, it was in a territory.
Right.
Isn't that, you said three, Montana, Idaho, and Wyoming.
Right. Most of it's in Wyoming. There's a small portion in Montana and just a little sliver in Idaho. Right. That's right. And of course, they became states later, but they weren't at the time. And of course, we all know that Yosemite eventually did become a national park. Finally, in 1906, I think it was, all of Yosemite was a national park.
What year was Yosemite actually open to the public that most people could go?
I guess it would be 1865. I mean, I guess people were trickling in, and mostly wealthy people before that, but just after it was made a park, I think that made a kind of a little rush to Yosemite.
And when Olmsted was envisioning the public taking advantage of this, he needed roads. So what did he do about that?
Well, he recommended that in his report, and that's what stuck in Josiah Whitney's craw, this request for $37,000 to build roads and a few other things, which he was afraid would come out of his budget, and that's why he helped quash that report.
But somehow the roads ultimately got built, and they cut down the travel time from Fresno or wherever they're coming from to the park by quite a bit. I mean, like 1 day instead of 4 days.
I think that's right, yeah.
And I don't know what year that was, but getting a road in there was important to bring not just the rich people, but everybody.
Right, right.
Let's see. And how did the national parks actually grow from Yosemite, even though it wasn't a national park?
Well, the second national park, if I remember correctly, was, you would never guess, it was Mackinac Island in Michigan.
Right.
And I don't exactly know how that happened, but it didn't last very long as a national park. I think about 20 years later, it was given to the state as a state park. And I think that's about where it should be. I think the third national park, if I'm not wrong, was Banff in Canada.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. It was discovered when the railroad was being built across Canada. They found these hot springs, and then they looked a little farther and they saw these incredible mountains. I think the Canadian Rockies are just spectacular. And it began as a small park and then grew over the years to become now a complex of 4 national parks.
Well, the railroads were very important in terms of access. And right. I thought that the fellow who ran I don't know if it was the Union Pacific, but one of the railroads that some people were saying it should go right into Yellowstone, but he kept it outside of Yellowstone and had some of the development outside of Yellowstone, but it still got people there. And the railroads were important.
They were.
You know, when Stephen Mather, who is from the Darien, Connecticut originally, was asked to run and you told the story about how he got the job.
Yeah.
There were 14 national parks in 1916 when he started, and when he finished, there were 40. And now I think you said there's something like 63. Now there's a lot of monuments and national forests and all kinds of other things managed by different groups in Washington, but pure national parks, it grew from 16 to 40 under Stephen Mather. And also they developed a system for managing them, and they had uniforms and guides, and they had conservation and preservation for all the parks.
Well, let's just stay a little bit with that 1916 year. That was the year that Congress passed what's called the National Parks Organic Act and created the National Park Service, which Stephen Mather became the first director of. And it also put language in that tells the Secretary of the Interior and the head of the Park Service how to manage the parks. And the language is basically, I'm sort of paraphrasing, but make it available for people today, but also preserve it for future generations. And guess who was the principal draftsman of the Organic Act? It was Frederick Law Olmsted Jr., who was sort of the heir of his father. He joined the firm as a young man. He certainly learned, almost everything he knew from his father. He imbibed his father's philosophy. So again, you see the influence of Frederick Law Olmsted reaching into the 20th century. He died in 1903, and very close to the language from his report gets into the Organic Act by way of his son.
And more projects were done under John Charles and Fred Olmsted, who was Frederick Law had adopted because he married his brother's widow.
Right.
And made him a son. And then Frederick Law Olmsted Jr. And they ran the firm until about the 1950s, and maybe some of their partners continued it. But the last Olmsteds were there in the 1950s, and they probably did more. And they had partners, so they did more projects than their father. But he set the philosophy, the style, and they followed in it. And they had worked with him on a lot of the projects, like the Biltmore, which was his last project. He needed help there at that time because he was starting to fail. And so they carried it on, and people get confused because there's Frederick Law Olmsted. Frederick Law Olmsted, how could he live that long? You know?
Right. Well, he was called Rick, and that's one way to try to separate them, but that's about as well as you can do. But yeah, that's true. And I think I have in the book the statistic that by the time the firm dissolved in 1950, they had trained fully half of all the landscape architects in the United States, which is kind of an amazing figure.
Because there weren't any landscape architects at the beginning, correct?
Right, but and also just because the firm was so good and was so respected, and people really wanted to learn from them, I think, as well.
From the beginning, he didn't want to be considered a gardener.
Right.
So he coined the phrase a landscape architecture. And so he's considered the father of American landscape architecture. But that didn't exist before the nomenclature. But most of his projects do not have formal gardens. Now, there are some formal gardens at the Biltmore, but they're right near the house. And then the rest of the access road is curving, and there's azaleas and dogwood. So most of his projects were meant to look like they were not man-made, even though they were man-made. And so he didn't do things like Versailles.
Right. That's right.
You've both touched on Mather and, of course, on Olmsted. And there's two other names that we associate with national parks, Teddy Roosevelt and John Muir. Can you add a little something to those two gentlemen?
When I started telling people I was writing a book about, the beginnings of the national park idea, almost everybody said, "Oh, Teddy Roosevelt." And I had to say, no, Teddy Roosevelt was barely out of knee pants when the first national parks were created, in 1872, for example. It's true, though, that he was probably the greatest conservationist president. And he also, his name in a way is behind maybe more units of the national park system than anybody else because of the 1906 Antiquities Act. And I'll just take a short minute to explain that. There was just a lot of theft going on in the late 19th century and early 20th century, especially of Indian pottery from federal lands. That was really the catalyst for the Antiquities Act. Congress passed an act that gave the president the authority to withdraw lands. This is all from the public domain, the land that is managed by the Bureau of Land Management. But there was probably some going on in national parks as well. But the main thing they were looking at was this vast acreage that was not in any particular protected way. So the president was able to withdraw that land, turn it into a national monument, kind of a junior brother, you might say, to a national park. And that way you would have federal protection. You would send the park rangers there, establish a monument headquarters. And then Roosevelt, never one to be shy about expanding his authority. The act said, it said, and of scientific interest, not just lands that have treasures like pottery, but also land of scientific interest. And Roosevelt said, well, I think that the Grand Canyon, for example, has scientific interest. I don't think anybody's stealing pots there, but the hell with that. I'm going to make it a national monument. And Grand Canyon did start as a national monument established by Teddy Roosevelt it later became a national park, but he did dozens of these all over the West using that authority.
And what about John Muir?
John Muir came a little bit late to be too much involved in this. He comes into the book a little bit later. One irony is that John Muir started out as a shepherd in Yosemite, working for a guy who was a squatter and who had a lot of, and whom the federal government had a lot of trouble getting out of Yosemite after it became a park. He accidentally, this guy who wanted to exploit Yosemite for his own private reasons, he accidentally introduced John Muir to Yosemite and the world of conservation with great effect.
Interesting.
So he was involved also in the Sierra Club?
Yep. Co-founder.
Yep.
He said something about wilderness is, or the national parks are for people who love wilderness, and it was controversial because, I mean, it was too exclusive, sort of. I think that was a quote.
There was a tension that I think is now not so tense as it used to be, but during much of the 20th century, between people who wanted to go to national parks and almost find the comforts of home, and those who said, no, wait a minute, it's not just, that doesn't, you can go to if you want swimming pools and ski resorts, you can go to those. This is raw nature, and let's keep it mostly raw. And so you're going to have a little bit of a hardship. You're going to have to camp out, and you're going to have to rough it a bit in the national parks. And there were times when the Park Service, I think, erred too much on the side of developing comforts for people. But in the last, I would say quarter century or more, they have leaned back the other way and tried to keep development out of especially the new parks. You can have hotels outside the parks. What's wrong with that? And then you have the interior of the park left pretty much alone.
And then there are a lot of national parks in the east, like the Everglades in Florida. There's the Blue Ridge Mountains or Smoky Mountains. There's one in Maine, Acadia.
Right.
So I think they sort of started in the West, but they came east. And
right.
Oh, there's such a treasure. I think one of you spoke about this, maybe Jonathan before, but what effect, if any, did being a Connecticut native and resident have on Olmsted's career?
Well, I think it was growing up with his father. His mother died when he was very, very young, like maybe 4 or something. And his father loved nature, and they went on walks, and they went on long walks. And Connecticut was very rural, and he loved it. And then he asked his father to help set him up as a farmer. And he was first in Sachem's Head, which is on the Connecticut coast. And then he was on the south shore of Staten Island in New York. And neither of those were thriving. Actually, he was asked by the New York Times, just sort of, we're jumping around in time, but to travel the South and write about slavery in the southern states. And he had to use a pseudonym so that people didn't know who was writing these articles because they were critical. So the pseudonym was Yeoman, and he wrote all these articles about slavery and the economics of slavery. And I think he basically believed it wasn't economic. It made the landowners boss of slaves, but they didn't do the work. And so he became an abolitionist. And then he wrote the book Cotton Kingdom, which was published and was read in Europe too, and was critical of slavery.
So he was a writer, he was a landscape architect. How many, let's list all his careers.
I got a list of those. It's kind of interesting. His father was a merchant, and it's a very successful merchant, and he'd done well. So he started as an apprentice as a merchant. Then he got on a ship to Asia.
Right.
and he was seasick a lot on the trip.
Yeah.
Thought he was going to see Canton or something, and basically he turned around and came back. But I mean, he experimented as a seaman. Then he was a writer for both some magazines in New York. He helped found a magazine, and he wrote for the New York Times, and then he was a gold mine manager.
Well, and you forgot the Sanitary Commission at Central Park. Yeah, it's astounding.
Yeah, and he was 43 when he came back from California, and that's when he said he was going to commit to being a landscape architect. Calvert Vaux had asked him to come back. He was thinking of staying out there, but he asked him to come back and work on Prospect Park. Well, he said more work is needed at Central Park to keep it on track, but they were going to do Prospect Park together. And they loved that park because there were no roads going across Prospect Park. The roads in Central Park go below ground, below grade level, and there's 4 of those, and they had to blast and tunnel them through, and that's one of the things that helped them win the competition. But I think their plan also was more grand than some of the ones that were more formal and were about flowers. So farming, that's after that he got that job, was because of his connections with the publishing people in New York that he got the job of being superintendent of the land that was being set aside for the park. And then he fell in with Calvert Vaux, and they won their competition. So he was in the right place at the right time, and he had the right skills and the right interest, both organizationally and also creatively.
And Dennis mentions in his book how driven he was.
Yes.
Almost to the point of exhaustion.
My favorite story, it's a quote from George Templeton Strong's diary. You know, he was a Manhattan lawyer who kept this long, long diary during the middle and later years of the 19th century. So he was on the board of Central Park, and one day he went over to watch what Olmsted was doing and got to the headquarters, and Olmsted kind of rushed in and had breakfast, and Strong says, and for breakfast, he had strong coffee and pickles. And then he puts 4 exclamation points after pickles. And that's how Olmsted was. He didn't care what he had for breakfast. He wanted to get to work.
Yeah, well, he certainly did a lot. Did you mention how many projects are really credited to him?
I did not.
Do either of you know?
The firm, about 500 parks.
Wow.
About 200 estates, some 40 colleges and secondary schools, and some some communities that they laid out.
Quite a...
The real estate and the roads, and those were all curving kind of communities. There's one outside of Chicago. He did a few of those.
One of the reasons he loved curving lines was that he hated racetracks, and he was afraid that if he put straight roads in any of his parks, they would be turned into carriage race tracks, and he fought against that. It was almost an obsession with him, I think. I'm not sure why, but I kind of agree with him. I mean, but partly because who would be racing but the rich with their carriages? He didn't want that. He wanted these parks to be for everybody.
We have a question.
Fair amount of sports that take place in Central Park. I mean, the marathon ends there, but there's, a lot of certainly walking and running and biking and skating and boating. They have lakes and boats for rent, no power boats, but just rowboats and canoes. And there's baseball, there's soccer, there's tennis. I mean, there's just a lot of different experiences. And one part of the Central Park is called the Ramble, and it's reminiscent of being in the Adirondacks. So it's 30 some odd acres of winding paths in thick forests with boulders and streams. And so they have lots of different experiences that you go through in Central Park.
Mm-hmm. Well, weren't there requirements to the competition that he had to include certain things?
Yes. And some of them they didn't like, but they, found a way to incorporate them. I mean,
they held their noses and went ahead.
We have a question that came in from the audience, and I think you touched on this a little bit, but we'll try it again. Can you speak a bit about Olmsted's training and youth and where his talent emerged?
Well, the training would be by observing nature and in the walks he did with his father in Connecticut. Then he took 6 months in Europe, and he traveled to England and saw parks there and in Europe. And then when he was superintendent of the park, he knew what had to be moved. The rocks and the soil and the drainage all had to be fixed. So he was kind of looking at it from an engineering point of view at the time, but he had the taste of nature, and he wanted his parks to be natural. And even though they weren't natural, they were man-made. The only thing in Central Park that wasn't man-made were the rocks that the ones they didn't blast, they kept, and they were 200 million year old rock that's all over Manhattan. And some of them were shaped by ice, but then he turned the swamps into lakes and ponds and streams. So I think the best lesson was doing Central Park. So then because it worked, he was in business, but he didn't really carry that out until he had all these other experiences. And he came back in 1943, and really all the rest of his career was in landscape architecture.
We have another question from the audience, which we touched on a little bit as well. Stephen Mather is my hero in the national parks. Can you talk about him a little bit? Which you did, but maybe if you want to elaborate a little bit more.
You want to tell this story? Like, he had been with Borax, which was a family business. And he had come up with the advertising slogan, Mule Team Borax. And then even he and a partner formed another company that was in Borax, and they were millionaires by 1900. And then he loved the parks. He loved nature too. And he went into a lot of the Western parks and found that they were in bad shape and deteriorated. And he wrote a letter to Washington complaining about the parks. And the Secretary of Interior, you worked for the secretary, wrote him back. You tell him.
Well, this was not the one I worked for, of course, but this was Franklin Lane, who had been a classmate of Mather's at, I think, UC Berkeley, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes.
And so he wrote back and said, okay, Steve, you don't like the way the parks are being run, you run them. And Mather did. He went to Washington and, started running them. And it was a little bit queasy because he wasn't officially hired, but they worked it all out. And then he became the first director of the National Park Service. And certainly his imprint on the Park Service is way above anybody else's.
Yeah.
Didn't he provide some of the funding as well?
The timing, well, yes.
He may have.
He paid his assistant one time.
Yeah.
They complained, the Congress complained that he was paying for things that he shouldn't pay for, but he did pay his assistant, and then maybe he worked for nothing, I don't know. But the timing was right because he had made a lot of money in business. He might have been ready for a change. When he got that challenge, he took it because he could do it. And then he didn't want to sit in an office in Washington. He told his assistant, Horace Albright, look, I'm not an organization man. I'm not going to push paper and sit here in this office. He said, I need you to do back me up because I can't do that alone. I want to be out in the field. So he took people on pack trips, and he took people, reporters, business people, government officials, and also painters and artists and photographers to the parks to see them for themselves as a marketing. He was constantly marketing at parks. He designed the uniform for the rangers, and he was always out in the field. So he'd been such a great salesman at Borax. He was a salesman for the parks, and the parks went from 16 to 40 under his leadership. So they set up a system for managing the parks.
We are getting close to the end of the hour, so let me ask you each one more question. Which is your favorite park?
Oh, gosh.
Which is your favorite candy?
Yosemite is, Janet and I lived in San Francisco for a bunch of years, and we went up to Yosemite and stayed at the Ahwahnee Hotel, which is beautiful, natural.
Yep.
It fits right in. It's not too glitzy, but it's nice, it's comfortable. And we drove up, well, you got the valley and all these famous things like the sheer
Half Dome.
Well, you have Half Dome, but then there's this
Right
guy,
ahead.
Free Solo, the guy.
Oh, yeah.
And you have a river in there, and you have campgrounds and everything, and several waterfalls, not just the Yosemite Falls, but the Bridal Veil. And so then we drove up on the rim, which is very high up, and we found a place called Olmsted Point. So I got out, and Janet took a picture of me standing next to the sign that said Olmsted Point. And so Yosemite's in our hearts.
I think I'll vote for Yosemite too.
Yeah. Pretty hard not to vote for it.
You could tell from the cover.
Right.
I still have the shiny one. Well, we are at 8 o'clock, which is our normal time to close down our events. But I want to thank you both so much for this really, really interesting presentation. Make sure you go out and get this book because there's so much more in it. And Dennis, you did such hard work here. I couldn't believe all the footnotes. You've really done your homework.
Oh, thank you, Kathleen.
And Jonathan, thank you so much for sharing your family legacy. It's just incredible.
It was fun.
It was fun.
pleasure.
The book is beautifully written, and with all those different quotes. I mean, Walt Whitman, Emerson, Dickens, Thoreau.
Yeah, that's true.
All of them.
It's a lovely book.
Well,
so
thanks so much for having us.
Thank you for coming, and everyone have a great holiday weekend. We'll see you soon. Bye, everyone.
You too.